Awesome. Thank you.
So welcome back, everyone. The way the format's going to work for this section is we're going to have a brief video by Benjamin, and it's just going to talk roughly about the overview of his paper, just so we can all be reminded. And then after the video is finished, we'll have some question and answer section, just like the other talks. So I'm going to go ahead and share his video, hopefully successfully, and then we'll go from there.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening. My name is Benjamin Formanek, and I am currently a PhD student at the University of Western Ontario. And today I'm going to be giving a pithy presentation of my paper titled Browne's Critique of Religious Propositions in Berkeley, a reply to Pearce. So to begin, in the introduction to the Principles of Human Knowledge, George Berkeley critically targets the view that words and propositions are meaningful if and only if they signify intelligible ideas. He argues that though words do indeed garner their meanings through convention, it is patently impossible for some one idea to be the token meaning of a word. Instead, Berkeley tells us that words are meaningful insofar as they dispose us to act or feel a way, so through certain conventionally applied rules. Peter Browne contests Berkeley's views about language on the basis that words with no ideational signification can play the role that Berkeley says they can and do in human discourse. Browne takes the communication of ideas to be necessary in fostering these types of instrumental goods. And because he believes Berkeley's views about the use of language is dependent upon the communication of ideas, it is self-defeating. Browne entreats his readers to consider how language can be prescriptive if it is actually the case that words may be significant, though they signify nothing. When considering religious propositions or utterances, Browne writhingly writes that having faith would be no more than believing in certain sounds and syllables, and that faith in God amounts to faith in a monosyllable. Browne has illuminated an apparent hole in Berkeley's view. If it is true that certain words do not or cannot signify determinate ideas, then it appears that certain propositions fail to be truth-valuable. In Chapter 8 of his book, Language and the Structure of Berkeley's World, Kenneth Pearce argues that once we uncover Berkeley's views about assent and truth, Browne's contention can be met with a satisfactory retort. According to Pearce, assent for Berkeley lies manifestly in dispositional states to have some passions, to act, or to have ideas. To assent to some proposition is not necessarily, as Locke's purported view, to match
because we don't have ideas of it. Well, it's kind of striking that the immaterialism is absent from Alciphron 7. So I'm not sure how much we can stake on the fact that he argues in this way elsewhere in interpreting what's going on in Alciphron 7, just because the immaterialism doesn't figure there, or in Alciphron in general.
Sorry, to be clear, are you critical of like the weight that I'm putting in Berkeley's combating materialism by saying that it means nothing, therefore it doesn't exist or it's meaningless, something like that, as opposed to in Alciphron where there's no discussion of immaterialism but religious language explicitly? Is that the idea?
More or less, because he argues in the way you described, like in the principles and the dialogues. Mm-hmm. But the fact that he would employ reasoning seemingly inconsistent with that in Alciphron, like maybe that points to it more being a tu quoque strategy than like representing his actual views about the relationship between intelligibility and ideation.
Right. Yeah. Good. Yeah, no, I mean, that checks out to me. I would agree. But I guess I just want to be clear about the force that those sorts of passages in my paper, that section is really supposed to have. I guess more than anything, it was supposed to just simply point out that Berkeley seems in some places to utilize some sorts of intelligibility requirements for meaning generally. And if we want to take those seriously, just in any case, it serves to the end of showing that if prescription is really the end of language, he maybe should be more charitable with respect to matter talk, I suppose. Something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Cool. Scott, did you have a question?
Yeah, so actually, turns out the question is like right on this point. It's about the sort of ruling out the meaningfulness of matter talk on the basis of it it's not having ideational content or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I guess one sort of big picture thought about that is just that, Berkeley's argumentative strategy throughout the principles and dialogues is often, well, especially in the dialogues, I think, is oftentimes pretty ad hominem. It's he's going after very particular groups of people at very particular points in time, and he oftentimes, I think, takes on the assumptions of the people that he's arguing against, even if he doesn't agree with those assumptions. He's going to show them that their views are inconsistent, and use that as a reason for them to give up their view. That, in addition to his other sort of positive arguments for immaterialism and idealism. So one thing that somebody like Kenny could say is just that all of that bluster in the principles and dialogues about matter, there Berkeley's assuming sort of a different criterion of meaning. Maybe he's assuming a Lockean theory of meaning because he's arguing against the Lockeans. But then later, in other places, he's not going to assume that. He's going to give other sorts of arguments that are definitive elsewhere. Yeah. So that's one.
Good, thank you. So I think I gestured towards this sort of possible objection, and I think the conclusion of my paper. But the thought there, I guess, at least from my hip, what I would say is that that's kind of an unfair equivocation, right? I mean, if we want to take seriously these notions again, that is to say that things are meaningless insofar as they have no ideational signification. He's equivocating between his notions of meaning in a way that is inconsistent across the board. So just the quickest I put it, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess I would just, I still think it's possible to just say, I can dig in my heels and say, you're reading that a little bit too literally. And if you understand what he's saying in the context of what he's doing in the principles or in the dialogues. You see that, when Berkeley says, oh, it's meaningless, therefore we should discard it. What he's doing is he's saying, you all think, by your own lights, that we should discard it. I might come back later and say, look, we need additional arguments. I think he actually does give additional arguments. So what do you say to somebody that's just really, really bent on that interpretive strategy? Do you just,
to be clear, that interpretive strategy is just to say that the angle at which he's approaching the materialist is fundamentally different from his larger picture of language and meaning. Is that the idea, generally?
Yeah, he's essentially pretending to take on a certain view of language just so that he can show these people how wrong they are.
Yeah, regrettably, I would just have to say poo-poo on Berkeley to somebody who would dig the heels in the ground like that.
So Kenny, since you've already had a chance, we'll come back to you in a second if that's okay, and we'll give David to ask a question. David, did you want to go ahead?
Okay, yeah, sure. Thank you. So I think for Benjamin, I just wanted to follow up on this point that was being brought up by Scott about Berkeley's use of the term meaningless. And I've not read this book by Peter Browne, but I imagine the debate between Berkeley and his contemporaries on the issue of meaning and whether one requires ideas in order to have a coherent account of meaning is within the context of the debate around Locke and the Bishop Sterling fit. So you recall in that debate, the bishop was finding that Locke's account of knowledge or meaning would lead to religious skepticism because he didn't have any idea about what substance is, for example.
That's right.
And I think so. So like when you point out in page 3 about how Browne entreats us to consider how language can be prescriptive if it is actually the case that words may be significant though they signify nothing. I wonder what Browne has to say as a follow-up to that claim? Does he bring in any issue having to do with Locke and the challenges that he faced with his account of meaning that Berkeley took himself to be solving?
Right. Yeah, good question. Not that I recall. No, he kind of dives in directly after that with his critique of religious propositions and utterances generally in Berkeley. That seems to be his focus.
Okay.
Yeah. So, with respect again, to your follow-up to Scott's point, I guess I just want to be clear that my bringing up the entire bit about the matter and its supposed meaninglessness in Berkeley for the reason that it doesn't have ideational content as it's significant or as that which it signifies is really to just kind of press force on what I see to be Browne's main worry for Berkeley and religious language is just that, look, for religious languages, there's no veridical representational content for God nor his attributes. And I'm like, wait, hold on a second. Like if Berkeley has the sort of account that Pearce espouses here, where it's like, well, hold on a second. Like truth in assent consists in the degrees to which we more or less, and these aren't Kenny's words because he's quite, he puts his foot down about this. It's more or less pragmatic, right? So it's our effective volitional responses in the world. Browne is really just saying, that like, hold on a second, like, can we really, well, it looks like we have more reason to be, language can be more prescriptive in those instances where we do in fact have ideational signification. And these passages that I'm pointing out just seem to show that Berkeley doesn't allow for that with the cases with the materialists. So again, it's the equivocation. That's just what I take issue with. Yeah.
Okay, I see. All right. Yeah. Okay, so maybe then the lack of reference in the case of matter on Berkeley's view. So when he says that matter is meaningless, according to you think that he should have held the same thesis he held regarding spiritual substance?
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so that he shouldn't have held different views regarding the two.
That's
okay.
Right. Yep, that's exactly right. Thank you. Yeah.
Kenny, we can go ahead and circle back to you.
Yeah, thanks. So I just want to jump in on this issue about whether ideational significance is somehow better and whether Berkeley relies on that at all in the argument against matter. So this is one of the most kind of common objections to use theory type interpretations, is this allegation that Berkeley says that matter is meaningless because it doesn't stand for an idea. But of course, there's the famous passage in the discussion of Hylas's parity argument in the dialogues, where Philonous says, I don't reject matter because I have no notion of it. I reject it because the notion of it is inconsistent. And Berkeley's pretty consistent in laying this dilemma over and over and over again, that either it's contradictory or it's meaningless. Why? Because the materialist keeps changing the definition, right? And some of the definitions are contradictory and some of them are meaningless. And when you look at what Berkeley actually says about whether people believe in matter in Principles 54, he actually has a quite subtle and complex account of belief in matter. He says, upon a narrow inquiry, it will not perhaps be found so many as is imagined do really believe the existence of matter or things without the mind. Strictly speaking, to believe that which involves a contradiction or has no meaning in it is impossible.
That's right.
And then skipping a line or so, he then says, in one sense indeed, men may be said to believe that matter exists. That is, they act as if the immediate cause of their sensations, which affects them every moment and is so nearly present to them, were some senseless, unthinking being. You see? So this acting as if is a pernicious kind of half belief or something. That kind of acting is a sort of thing that could constitute belief. But it's defective because the kind of, on my reading, I would say, because the rules for the use of the word matter are just not sufficiently well defined to let somebody be a kind of robust and consistent follower of those rules, as you would have to be if you were going to have full-on belief in matter.
Right. Great. Thank you. Yeah. So two things. So I'll address the latter thing you said first, then come back to something that you had said earlier. So with respect to religious utterances or religious propositions or spiritual beings in Berkeley, you would want to say, well, I think you do, but I guess I'm unclear on how you can arrive at this, that those sorts of strings of words or propositions do somehow or help us to operate well more so in the world than would matter. And that, I guess, I'm kind of unclear on how we can go about that. And then secondly, I guess this segues into the second point. What are the reasons, I'm curious for you, that you think it is on Berkeley's view that talk of matter is either lands us into contradiction or is meaningless? And I guess, again, that's why I want to highlight these sorts of passages. It seems to be that they're inconsistent insofar as they raise or they attempt to raise inconsistent ideas, or they're meaningless in virtue of the fact that there can be no possible, that is impossible, ideas in our minds. And that, again, seems to apply for spirit talk.
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends on what kind of definition of matter you're talking about, right? So ordinary folks, when they hear matter, they think you're talking about something sensible.
Right.
And if you're talking about something sensible, then you ought to have an idea of it, because sensible things are things we have ideas of.
That's right. Yep.
Or can have ideas of. But if you're talking about the Lockean notion, then again, he's just, or the Cartesian notion or whatever, he just keeps putting out there that challenge to, like, tell me in enough detail what this thing is really supposed to be, right? And he's trying to say every attempt to do that lands in some kind of contradiction. And that's how I think we should read all of these passages. And so I do think some of them should be read ad hominem, as Scott is saying, where, like, we have to be careful in each place. When is Berkeley talking about his own view? When is he talking about his opponent's view? Note that in the bit you quote from Principle 16, it's say you, I have no idea, right? And then Berkeley is saying, well, you must think you have some relative idea or something. In his mature view, relations are things we have notions of, not ideas.
That's right.
But this text is written before he's drawn that distinction, right? But saying we need some kind of, okay, we need some sort of way of giving meaning to this, which just is lacking on all the accounts that the materialists are giving. That, I think, is the core issue. Yeah,
I 100% agree. And I think it's in virtue of them not being able to have any sort of coherent ideational content. But yeah, great. Thank you. That is helpful, though. I mean, context is important here. So I appreciate that, both your comment there, Kenny, and Scott's as well as David's. Thanks.
I'm going to insert myself in here just for a second. And this is, keep in mind, this is coming from a non-Berkeley scholar. So I imagine I'll be quickly dismissed. But I was struck by a little bit of your paper where you say that Berkeley thinks statements like matter exists are false and not just nonsensical. But what I've been hearing here is, we think about these statements as contradictory. And generally when something's contradictory, it doesn't really have a truth value, or it's meaningless. And I can't understand how something that's meaningless, just a random collection of noise, could have, a proper truth value. And it seems important to your thesis that it does have a truth value. But the passages that you cited in your paper didn't clearly express to me that he was saying it has a truth value. He was just saying it's meaningless. And so I was wondering if you could fill that in a little bit, or if I'm misunderstanding, or if this is just something in Berkeley scholarship that's taken for granted. No,
this is a really good point. Thank you. You know what? In this specific case, I think this is on page 9. This might be sloppy on my part. In fact, I would say that it is. But right, so, I mean, the two passages that I cited here, is it just the two? So let me see the first one. Yeah. Right. Yeah, no, I don't have any passages on hand besides these two. This came from a larger paper. I apologize, and I just took these two, cherry picked them out of it, and it's a sloppy use of language. But I mean, I would be happy to open the door to Kenny or somebody else that is more familiar with, well, I suppose specifically Kenny here, to his fill of Lang and his considerations concerning truth and falsity with respect to matter and talk of matter specifically. Yeah.
I mean, my reading would be he thinks that the term matter is ambiguous, and on some interpretations, the claim that matter exists is false, and on other interpretations, it's meaningless. And when it's false because contradictory. Right.
Yeah. That's helpful. Thanks. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Aaron. Yeah.
Scott, did you have another question? You want to go ahead?
Yeah, so I also just wanted to talk a little bit more about your account of the meaningfulness of spirit talk. Mm-hmm. And you rightly point out that Berkeley seems to be adamant that we definitely don't have ideas of spirits, but he does think that we have notions of spirits. And then there's a whole lot of argument about what that actually means, and whether that's, notions are actually supposed to do any explanatory work in Berkeley or not. I was just wondering, why can't Berkeley get meaning for spirit talk, just from our, what he oftentimes describes as an immediate knowledge of ourselves? Sure, that's not going to give us an idea of ourselves. It's not going to have any sensory content, but he still seems to think that there's something going on up here when we think about ourselves. And so why can't that sort of play the role of an idea and give meaning to spirit talk? And then, of course, we all know the standard story that goes from, okay, I know my spirit, so I can then make an analogy between my spirit and another person and another spirit. So if I can know about myself that I'm wise, then I can know that Socrates is wise, and all the way up the chain to say that God is wise. Do you find something particularly objectionable about that story for Berkeley?
So thanks. Yeah. So I think there's something that need to flag to be careful. So firstly, I don't think that coming from a first person point of view, that like spirit or Benjamin, the utterance of that word alone, myself doing it, I don't think that's meaningless. I do, and I agree. I have immediate knowledge of my own being, and it's meaningful insofar as I have immediate knowledge of that which is signified by the word Benjamin. However, once we start to build complex sentences and the subject and the predicate is involved, specifically concerning other spirits, let alone God in this case, and that's what most of this has been about, as you know, trying to attach predicates that presumably signify ideational content to something that is not apt to bear description is my gripe. So hopefully that clears things up.
So I actually was wondering about that, the apt to bear descriptions thing. So sure, you might have a problem with being able to say something like Benjamin is tall or something like that, because tall is signifying ideational content, whereas Benjamin supposedly refers to a spirit. So I can see how you might think there's a problem there. You could maybe get around that by saying, oh, well, when we're talking about Benjamin in that sense, we're talking about Benjamin's body, not Benjamin the spirit. But anyways, that aside, what about, there seem to be a lot of other non-idea descriptions that would be apt. For instance, is wise, or is angry, or is hungry. These seem to be the sorts of things that we can know through, in a similar way that we know ourselves, right? Through this sort of immediate awareness or something like that. And if we can become aware of those sorts of things, why can't we use those? Why is my spirit not able to bear that description?
That sort of description. Right. Good. Yeah. Thank you. So I guess I would just push back with a question then. So how is it, with your or anybody else's understanding of Berkeley, that we can even come to know that we have hunger? What is it that elicits our knowledge, our immediate knowledge of hunger? Is it not some sort of a phenomenological kind of feeling that we might want to call an idea, or is it something other? So that's kind of where I would want to come from with that.
Yeah, so maybe hunger isn't the best
or even wisdom.
example.
I mean, I guess that's,
Oh.
I don't want to like really, really funnel things here, because I think this is juicy, and I think this is a problem for kind of what I'm saying here, probably a little bit too forceful. But generally, I think all things that are going to be volitional, or things that we want to consider an activity in some sense, are going to kind of funnel into our knowledge of them being in virtue of some sort of phenomenological field, qua idea, something like that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks.
So I had just a little follow-up on that. You say at one point that for Berkeley, faith doesn't terminate in the ear, but in the will. So I'm curious what, I don't know if it makes sense to say, what the volitional content would be when you're having an act of will based on faith or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So, I mean, what you're quoting is Kenny. So Kenny says this. So that's actually really interesting. And I agree. This kind of spells some sort of problem so far as I see it, right? I mean, under my interpretation, which might be wildly misconstrued, but this is kind of my interpretation here. So far as we only can recognize volitions in virtue of whether it's going to be a concurrent or, subsequent or consequent sort of idea, like a train or, a one item sort of thing. I too am curious what it is to have, truth and assent based on effective and volitional responses, if everything bottoms out in ideas regardless. Right. It's a good question. Ken, you want to chime in?
Sure, yeah, if I can follow up on that. The kind of bottoming out in ideas that you're talking about is something that Browne endorses really explicitly. And that's why Browne at one point makes the shocking statement that if analogy doesn't work, then his philosophy will be reduced to Hobbesian materialism, right? Because all ideas are of material things, and all the basic materials of our cognition are ideas. And so for Browne, we have to somehow, by analogy, be able to use these ideas whose proper objects are material things to think about immaterial things.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's Berkeley's view. I think that Berkeley thinks that we know our own activity in the doing of it, right? That we have this kind of, and we can't call that, I mean, maybe we should say there's a phenomenology of action there. That's, if you want to say that, that's fine. But it's not, but it shouldn't be understood as an idea, because it's an inherently active kind of phenomenology, the experience of doing. And then in terms of what's going on in the, like, faith terminating in the will, that's, it's beliefs are dispositions, habits, etc. of the will. So it's not that there is a particular volition that is the believing or something, like there might be maybe for Descartes. Will assents to a proposition. The sort of proper faith is a kind of steady, persistent, dispositional state of the will, if you like, whereby you're disposed to follow certain rules. That, I mean, that's how I read what's going on there with faith and belief, and with our ability to conceive of actions.
Okay, interesting.
Does Berkeley, does he actually locate a disposition in the will itself, or is it sort of part of a different faculty?
Well, remember, he doesn't believe in a real distinction of faculties.
Oh, okay, yeah. Fair enough.
He does talk particularly in Cyrus about habit, and that shows up a few other places. But I don't think he really gives an analysis of what it is and how it fits into the metaphysics of spirit. So I think that, as far as I know, is kind of an unanswered question for Berkeley. One of the reasons I use that phrase, it doesn't terminate in the ear, it terminates in the will, there actually is a line in the Johnson correspondence talking about the philosophy of time, not about religion, but where he says people have these confusions because they've misunderstood the nature of words, which as often terminate in the will as in the understanding.
Yeah. So I'm still pretty hung up on being careful to not implicitly separate the volition from its extension. I mean, surely for Berkeley, we can't have pure volition absent some sort of ideational, glue, or sorry, something to adhere it with. I mean, by what means? Am I curious? I'm honestly befuddled. Can we even recognize that we have a volition or a dispositional state, etc.? Any activity of mind or whatever it is you want to say, absent having corresponding ideas. They operate about them. That's what it is. They don't just operate full stop. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't know what you mean. I don't know. And Todd is right here.
Yeah, that's right.
In the chat window. But you want to be careful about saying a corresponding idea, right?
Sure, right, yeah.
So it's not as though we have an idea of the volition. That's not going to work.
Well, of course, sorry. And I wanted to be clear about that too. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, but in some way we're going to have to, I mean, and this is, so Locke believes in ideas of reflection. He thinks there are ideas of volitions. But even he thinks that we don't get those ideas until the mind starts operating on sensory ideas, right? So, and Browne's going to say that too on his own analogical account of how we get kind of analogical concepts of mind. So it's going to be, so I think we are going to have to start out at the ground level with this kind of volition or activity starting out as a kind of operation about ideas, yeah. And that's going to have to be what's the ground floor for our awareness of our own activity. But we need this like reflection or consciousness, Berkeley calls it, that is an awareness of our own activity about those ideas, which can't be reduced to the ideas themselves.
Sure.
And that's going to be different than Browne, who thinks we see these orderly changes of ideas and then we sort of analogically conceive of an ordering principle of some kind. It's not like that for Berkeley. That ordering principle is something we have immediate awareness of.
Agreed. Yeah. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any thoughts, concerns, or questions?
One thing I could add quickly, just as a question, is there anywhere in Browne where he raises the issue for the Berkeleyan view? I've seen this objection raised like in contemporary times, but does Browne ever talk about the problem of how without ideational content you're able to individuate different religious propositions as the ones that they are? Like there's this problem that, like, Berkeley says, well, belief in X causes us to be, well, it involves the disposition towards charity or whatever. It's like, well, you might be able to say that about many different religious propositions within the same system, and then it's not clear without the ideational component whether the use part can individuate these propositions. Does Browne bring this up at all?
Not that I know of. No, not specifically. Yeah.
Okay. I was just curious.
Because I mean, this question does seem, it seems pretty foresighted. Well, that is Browne's objection here. That's really what drew me to it in the first place. But yeah, that's a good question.
Well, if there are no other questions, I think we can end just a few minutes early, take a little bit longer break, and I will see everyone back here in about 10 minutes for Kyoto's talk.
Yeah, just wanted to thank everybody for listening and participating, and special thanks to Kenny for having an awesome book and giving me the opportunity to have some pretty cool stuff to write about. So thanks, everyone.